Okay, pop quiz. What's the one thing that always seems to happen, like clockwork, on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November?
Besides, pumpkin spice, everything suddenly vanishing from store shelves.
You got me there. Okay, you know what I mean. It's election day in the U.S. But seriously, though, it always makes me wonder why that specific day? Why not just make it a Saturday or even just the first Tuesday of the month? Keep it simple.
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people have, and for good reason. On the surface, it does seem kind of random, but like a lot of things in history, there's a pretty interesting story behind how we landed on that date. Ready to do a little depth dive into the archives and uncover the aha moments?
Absolutely, let's do it. I always love a good history lesson, especially when it involves something we take for granted, like Election Day.
It's easy to forget that these things weren't always a given, right?
Okay.
So before we get too far into the nitty-gritty, we got to do a quick refresh on something crucial to this whole election day puzzle, the Electoral College. Because understanding one kind of requires understanding the other, right?
You're totally right. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of Election Day and forget that here in the U.S., we don't actually directly elect the president, do we?
We don't. We've got this whole system where each state gets a certain number of electors, and the number they get is based on their population.
It's like instead of just counting up all the votes nationwide, you're trying to win the most states, almost like a big, complicated game.
It's a good analogy, and the candidate who ends up winning the popular vote in each state, they usually end up snagging all of that state's electors.
And then it's those electors, those folks, chosen to represent the state's voters, who officially elect the president.
Exactly. So with that in mind, let's rewind the clock back to the early 1800s, the early days of the United States.
Back when things were a tad different, to say the least.
Oh, for sure. We're talking a time when the U.S. was basically a nation of farmers, think vast farmlands instead of skyscrapers. Life revolved around the planting and harvest seasons, and guess what? By November, most of the harvest was done.
Which meant,
Which meant that people finally had a bit more time on their hands, time for things like, say, traveling to go vote.
makes sense, they couldn't exactly hop in their cars or catch a quick train like we do nowadays.
Not quite. Think horses, buggies, long and bumpy journeys, hoping the weather would cooperate, the whole 9 yards. So November worked out pretty well. The worst of winter hadn't hit yet, so travel was still doable. But there's another piece to this puzzle, and it has to do with a law passed back in 1792.
Ooh, a law. Tell us more.
Right. So this law stated that states had to choose their presidential electors within 34 days of when those electors were scheduled to meet and officially, pick the president.
And when was that big meeting?
Wouldn't you know it, it was set for the first Wednesday in December. So basically, the timing of that December meeting ended up dictating when states had to hold their elections in November.
It's like a historical chain reaction of scheduling.
Right.
But here's where I'm starting to get a little lost. We're in the 1800s, right? What about the whole rise of railroads? Didn't that shake things up a bit?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's where things get really interesting. Picture this. It's the 1840s. Railroads are starting to crisscross the nation. People and information can suddenly move much faster than ever before. But then, and this is a big one, right on the heels of the railroad, comes this game-changing invention, the telegraph.
And bam, suddenly news and information, which used to travel at the speed of a horse-drawn carriage, could be transmitted in the blink of an eye.
In minutes. Can you imagine? That was revolutionary.
Talk about a game changer for communication. But I bet that created a whole new set of challenges, especially when it came to something as important as elections.
Oh, you better believe it. Because think about it, if people could suddenly find out who won one state while polls were still open in another, well, that could lead to all sorts of chaos and confusion, maybe even manipulation.
It's true. I never thought about it that way. Imagine finding out your candidate lost in a landslide in another state while you were still waiting to cast your vote. It could totally affect your decision.
It could even lead to the sense that the system was rigged or unfair, right? Like, why bother voting if the outcome seems predetermined?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And to make matters even more complicated, wasn't this also the era of those powerful political machines like Tammany Hall in New York City? Weren't those guys known for, shall we say, playing fast and loose with the rules sometimes?
You could say that. Let's just say election integrity wasn't exactly their top priority. The fear, and it wasn't totally unfounded, was that with faster travel, someone could literally cast a ballot in one state, then hop on a train and try to vote again in a different state.
Talk about a recipe for disaster. I can see why standardizing Election Day became such a big priority.
Exactly. The existing system, as it was just ripe for potential voter fraud and shenanigans. So in 1845, Congress decided to step in and bring some order to this electoral Wild West.
And their solution was,
Their solution, after much debate, I'm sure, was to officially declare that Election Day moving forward would be held on the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November across the entire nation. And, well, the rest, as they say, is history.
so there we have it, the birth of Election Day as we know it. But wait a minute.
Mhm.
That still doesn't explain the Tuesday thing. Why Tuesday?
Ah, yes, the Tuesday mystery. It's a question for the ages. Well, to crack the case of Tuesday, we got to take another little trip back in time to those horse and buggy days, say, around the 1840s.
Okay, I think I'm getting a sense of the vibe back then.
Imagine you're a farmer in, let's say, rural Ohio, and you got to travel all the way to the county seat to cast your vote. Could be a long trip.
Yeah, and Sundays were definitely out of the question for traveling back then, right? Weren't folks pretty strict about the whole Sabbath thing?
Oh, absolutely. Sunday was for church and family time, not hitting the road for a day at the polls. And as for Monday, well, Monday had its own special designation, you see, bookkeeping day.
Hold on a minute. People were more worried about interrupting bookkeeping than voting. Wow, they took their accounting seriously back then.
Hey, got to keep those ledgers balanced. So Tuesday it was. It gave people enough time to travel after Sunday and didn't mess with any important business matters. It was, shall we say, a compromise of sorts.
It all comes down to horses, buggies, and bookkeeping. Who knew? But here's the million-dollar question. Does that logic still hold up in our modern, super fast-paced world? I mean, let's be real, things have changed a bit since then.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What made perfect sense back in the 1840s might not make so much sense in the 21st century, right?
I mean, think about it. Most of us can't just take a random Tuesday off work to go vote. And it's not like it's a national holiday dedicated to civic duty or anything.
Exactly. It's just another workday for most people, and that's led to a lot of debate about whether having Election Day on a Tuesday is actually a good idea or if it discourages people from voting.
It's true. Taking time off work, dealing with potentially losing pay, then maybe facing those crazy long lines at polling places. It's not exactly the most convenient system.
You're preaching to the choir. It can be a real barrier for people, especially those juggling multiple jobs and family responsibilities, or who just don't have a lot of flexibility in their schedules.
And then you look at other democratic countries that hold their elections on weekends or even make it a national holiday, and you can't help but wonder.
Right, like maybe we could be doing things a little differently.
Exactly. If the goal is to have as many eligible voters participate in our democracy as possible, wouldn't it make sense to, make it a bit easier for them?
It's a compelling argument, and there have been plenty of proposals to shake things up here in the U.S. Some folks are pushing hard for weekend voting, while others are advocating for making Election Day a national holiday, maybe even combine it with Veterans Day, which already falls in November.
I've seen that make Election Day a holiday movement gaining some real traction lately. It would be pretty incredible to see that happen.
It would be a huge change. But, of course, even with something as seemingly positive as making voting easier, there are always counter-arguments, right?
Yeah, it's never simple, is it?
Some people worry that messing with a system that's been around for so long, even if it's not perfect, could be really disruptive. Plus, there's the whole cost factor and potential for confusion to consider.
I can see that. Change can be tricky.
Yeah.
And honestly, some people argue that instead of focusing on changing the day itself, we should be putting more effort into making voting more accessible in other ways.
Right. Like, what are some other options?
Well, things like expanding early voting periods and making mail-in ballots more readily available, which, to be fair, many states have already started doing, could have a bigger impact.
That's a really good point. Early voting has been a game changer for a lot of people. It lets them cast their ballots weeks before Election Day, on their own time, without the stress of taking time off work or waiting in endless lines.
And mail-in ballots have become super popular too, especially recently because it takes away that barrier of having to physically go to a polling place on a specific day, which can be a huge obstacle for some.
Absolutely. So it seems like we've got this really interesting push and pull happening, this tension between tradition and progress.
On one hand, we've got this long-standing historical system with roots in a time of horses and buggies.
And on the other, we've got this rapidly evolving society with different needs, different priorities, and a real desire for more flexible and inclusive ways to participate in our democracy.
It's like this whole debate about Election Day is kind of a microcosm of this larger conversation we're having as a society.
Yeah.
How do we balance respecting our past and the way things have always been done with adapting to the present and shaping a future where everyone feels like they have a voice and that their vote truly matters.
Couldn't have put it better myself. And that's what I think makes digging into these seemingly mundane historical details like why Tuesday so fascinating. It helps us understand not just how our democracy works, but how it's evolved over time and how we might think about shaping it moving forward.
Yeah, it's like we're peeling back the layers of a historical onion. We started with this simple question, why Tuesday? And look where we ended up.
And much like peeling an onion, there might be a few tears along the way as we confront some of those, shall we say, less than savory aspects of our history.
It's true. Because the reality is, these accessibility issues surrounding Election Day highlight that our democracy isn't perfect, that there's always room for improvement.
No system designed by humans ever is, right? But I think that's what makes understanding the why behind something like Election Day all the more crucial, especially when we see those dishearteningly long lines at polling places or when we're meticulously filling out our mail-in ballots.
It's like a little voice whispering, hey, the system wasn't handed down from on high. It wasn't always this way. It was shaped by the needs and limitations of a particular time and place.
A time and place very different from our own.
Exactly. So maybe, just maybe, it's time to revisit some of these traditions with a fresh perspective, given how much the world has changed since those horse and buggy days.
It's a conversation worth having. Now, we certainly don't have all the answers, but we've explored the historical reasons behind Election Day, the arguments for and against changing it, and some of the efforts underway to make voting more accessible regardless of the day.
Right. We've covered a lot of ground today, looked at the issue from all sides.
And now, dear listener, it's your turn to weigh in. What do you think?
Do we stick with the tradition of Tuesday voting simply because it's what we've always done? Or do we acknowledge that times have changed and maybe our democracy needs to change with them, become more inclusive and accessible in the process?
It's a question worth pondering. So, as you prepare to head to the polls this year,
Or maybe even grab a pen and paper to write to your representative.
we'll leave you to ponder those possibilities. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the history of Election Day. It's been a fascinating journey.
Absolutely. And until next time, keep those brainwaves buzzing.